part of the motivation for this goes back to a 7-year-old boy that rode our church bus. 2 years ago, I asked him one day, I said, his name is Milam. And I said, Milam, I said, did you have fun tonight at church? And Milam said to me, he said, yes. And I thought he's going to tell me they had fun with their children's church. He
Mhm.
said, praying is fun.
Wow.
He didn't say playing is fun. He said praying to
Praying
God
is fun.
is fun.
Hello and welcome to the Andrew Gonzalez podcast. We've got a special guest today I'm very excited to visit with. This is episode 2 of a series I'm calling The Author's Angle, where I interview ministers in the Church of God who have recently put out a book. And the book that we're going to talk about today is actually releasing at the airing of this video. So if you're watching this on day 1, the book releases today. So I'm super excited to have Bishop Danny Pankey from Blytheville, Arkansas. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Well, I'm honored to be able to be part of it today.
Danny, I want to say when you're coming into a movement in your 40s and most of your ministry has been somewhere else, has been in a different fellowship. I was with the independent holiness people for 15 years. It's kind of intimidating, but you encounter people that you feel like you really want to get to know. And sometimes there's just kind of a little hedge between you, it feels like. But you welcomed me into the Arkansas Church of God with arms wide open. And probably, I was just thinking about the landscape of the state, and you're one of the pastors that I've had some of the most meaningful conversations with. And so I want you to know I appreciate that, and I enjoy when we get to visit at different state events. But welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners? Tell us who you are, where you're serving, and then we'll go from there.
Well, first of all, Andrew, I want to say I appreciate those kind words, but you're one of those who's very easy to talk to, and you kind of open yourself up to people. So I think it's easy for people to become not just an acquaintance, but a friend of yours. So I always look forward to meeting new people. And I tell people all the time, I tell people in my
Sure.
church, I tell other folks, you can't have too many friends. We should always look to make new friends. And it's part of one of my philosophies as I pray, and we'll get into some other things here a little later. But I am glad about the others, in my life, as I call them. But I'm lead pastor at Ruddle Road Church of God in Blytheville, Arkansas. We've been here 16 years, but I've been a
Yeah.
lead pastor for 28 years, and this is my
Wow.
third church. But I also have the privilege of being able to pastor in my hometown and mine and my wife's hometown. So it's a tremendous honor, and I pastor some wonderful people, and I have in pastoring this church, I'm one of the exceptions. I followed a long-term pastor, who followed the person who established the church where it's at. So the last 3
Wow.
pastors at this church are myself, Pastor Decanter, James Decanter,
Okay.
and Pastor
Sure.
Terry Watson. So and I have the privilege of being good friends with each of those guys. So we're blessed to be here.
Awesome.
Terry
Okay.
Watson moved it to this location and built the sanctuary that I'm in and the parsonage that we're
Gotcha.
sitting in right now. So I don't know, there are probably 15 pastors or so. As just the last 3 have been here for 43 years combined.
Yeah, that's awesome. Pastor Travis Creekmore and I having a conversation the other night. We're talking about the importance of, well, maybe not the importance, but the benefit of having a long-term pastor that can, invest in the community and really connect to the church. Now, you said this was your hometown, so born and raised or grew up? What? Where? I
Born
guess
and
you're from
raised
Blytheville
here.
originally?
Yeah, I'm actually from a farm outside of Blytheville. Went to
Okay.
school I graduated from Gosnell High, which is just next door. It's next door, but Blytheville was going to town
Okay.
for us, and Blytheville was where my mom
Gotcha.
and dad both worked. And so
Yeah.
and then my wife, she's what I call the city girl. She was in the city, but uniquely, she hates when I tell this story. But Our church is a mile down the road from where I kissed her for the very first time in the driveway of her parents' house. So, and I tell kids
Yeah,
all the time that from our church, I said that's where I kissed the first lady for the first time. And of course,
there you
and
go.
I'm talking about the kids in the
Yeah,
church. They're like, "Ooh, gross," but yeah. So I do tell too
sure.
much, and uh, and I've already been accused of
Well,
writing too much about our
that's
family
pretty
too.
special. Yeah. I think it's I think it's special that you're there. I've said often, I was a funeral director for 15 years. I've served in ministry I've been in Hot Springs for 20 years now. But I've often said, I love what I do. I love serving people. And the only thing that would make it better was if I was serving the people I grew up with, is how I felt.
Yeah.
Now I've lived here longer than any other place that I've ever lived before. So I
Mhm.
think I look at it a little differently now because this is home.
Yeah.
But I think it's special that you're back in your hometown. Kind of tell us your faith history. Were you raised in church? Were you raised in the Church of God? Did you come to faith a little later in life? Tell us a little bit about that.
I'm really blessed. I was raised by my mom and dad, which is, a good thing. But
Hmm.
we didn't really get in church till I was about 8 years old. My dad, for the first 5 years of my life, he was a drunk, and he was a mean drunk. And this is another book down the road that I'll be sharing his story. But my dad, when I was 5 years old, gave up alcohol to stay with our family. It's before he got saved, which is unusual. And
Hmm.
so he could preserve
Yeah.
our family. And for the last 45 years of his life, up until he died, he never drank again. I never considered him an alcoholic because when he gave it up cold turkey. And I'm sure, I don't know
Wow.
if there was ever urges, but his main urge was to uh, be with his family. And when
Yeah.
we had lived in town for most of my first 8 years of life, and we moved out to our farm. We have a family farm, and we moved out there when I was 8, and my mom and dad insisted we get in church at the time. So I grew up in a small Southern Baptist church on a gravel road, which is where I got saved when I was 2 weeks before I turned 19 years old. I don't know, part of the reason I got saved may
Okay.
have been, the book, 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming in 88, because I got saved in August and he was supposed to
Yeah.
come in September of that year. And so,
Right.
but
Right.
no, a world missionary was preaching a revival that I got saved. I'll never forget the night. And there's a whole lot to that. But I mean, I went to church with them, and I had a choice to, go to church on Sundays or go chop cotton. And if I went to church, I didn't have to chop
Hmm.
cotton. I would tell people the only drug problem I ever had is I was drugged to church because I really didn't have much of a choice. But I'm so
Right.
glad my mom and dad,
Yeah.
made me do that. And when I finally came to the Lord, when I was, again, right before I was 19, I really didn't stay in the Baptist church long. I began dating my wife, who was Church of God from the time of birth,
Okay.
and I ended up going with her to a revival after she
So
kissed
which
me.
press pause, which church was she at there
She
in the
was
Church
at
of God?
well, what is now the Pathway Church used to be called the Cherry
Okay.
Street Church of God. So
Yeah.
that is really my home church. When Pathway moved to where it's at
Mhm.
now, I actually was on staff there. I became, after I got out of college, I taught school. They had a Christian school at Pathway. So one,
Okay.
so and again, I live in a town out of with Pathway and our church, and we are very very close with the pastors and previous pastors of the Pathway family. Which is
Yeah.
the way I think it should be.
Of course. So
So
you get saved. You start going to a Church of God with your wife, well, soon to be wife, I assume, or you got married and then started attending that church?
uh, no, I started attending when we were dating, and
Okay.
I fell in love with the church because of the people there. Before it
Sure.
was, I mean, obviously there was a different move of the spirit, but it was the people. Of course, my wife. And
Right.
I probably would went anywhere with her anyhow. But
Sure.
but
Good thing she
she.
wasn't Mormon.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. She's my wife is my rock, and
Sure.
she helped so much, and adding to the faith that I already had, and she still does.
Yeah,
I couldn't pastor. I couldn't pastor without her. If I mean, or I wouldn't know how to pastor without her because
sure.
she just does so much for me personally, and she's the one that keeps me from making a fool of myself, and I make a fool of myself plenty of times. So she keeps me from being
So
a complete fool.
so you're coming out of the Southern Baptist Church into the Church of God. How long before you received the baptism of the Holy Ghost?
4 years. 4 years.
Okay.
I was actually had gotten out of college. I was teaching school at the Pathway School. We had a revival with an evangelist that many people around Arkansas will remember. His name is Chris Owensby.
Oh,
And
yeah. I've met Chris.
and Chris, on a Tuesday night in October of 1992, I received the baptism of the Holy Ghost during that revival. And 8 months later, yeah, right about 8 months later, on the Sunday before Memorial Day, he was doing a revival again. God called me to preach, and
All
so,
right.
so that's. I mean, so Chris has been he's been part of my ministry because the first time I ever went to church with my wife was the first revival he ever did at what was the old Cherry Street Church of God. Now I'm not going to lie to
Oh,
you. When I
wow.
went in, I
Okay.
had never been in a Pentecostal church, and it was a revival
Sure.
service, and my wife was a church piano player, so she left me on the pew to go play the piano, and I remember, I mean, I'll be honest, I wondered when these folks are gonna get the snakes out,
Yeah.
and but I stayed the whole time because even though I was raised Southern Baptist, my mom had been filled with the Holy Spirit, and, I
Oh, wow.
knew it was real. I knew what they were experiencing was real. I just
Sure.
I didn't understand what they were experiencing, and I don't know that I always understand what I'm experiencing, even today.
Sure, of course.
As much
Yeah,
as I've studied, I think God still has given us a lot of mystery.
of course. So you feel the call to preach. How how soon before you have your first ministry assignment? Is this teaching job there at the school? Is that kind of your first station of ministry or what?
I was already teaching at the school, so we were in a building program, and I used to be in charge of or the chairman of MIP for Arkansas. I did it for 7 years, and I
Mhm.
told this story a lot to them because I think this is one of those, and I think it goes along with some of the things that you want to ask. And the night we had the service on that Sunday night before Memorial Day. I got called to preach, and which school year's over. And the next day on Memorial Day, there was no barbecue. It was come up to the building. We got to work because we're building this building that has to be done for school to start in or August or September. I was working beside Pastor Rigney, not Danny Rigney, but his father, Senior LV Rigney, who is my mentor. And we were hanging insulation together, and he's a very driven man. He'd had a
Okay.
lot of people on his staff over the years. And I'm excited. God called me to preach. And I said, Pastor Rigney, I just want you to know last night, God called me to preach. And I'm waiting for
Mhm.
the hoop and holler and praise the Lord. And I'll never forget his response.
Yeah.
He looked over at me with the insulation in his hand, and he said, "Go hang that insulation." Went back to hanging insulation. Never said another word. Of course, getting near June, they have camp meeting. He's gone for camp meeting for a while. I'm still working on the building. So I thought, well, when he gets back,
Mhm.
we'll talk about this. Comes back from camp meeting. By that
So he
time, we're
still has
hanging.
not said a word. He still has not acknowledged the fact that you've told him that you're called to preach. Okay.
No, no, he hadn't acknowledged it. And I mean, we got to get this building done. And he's very driven, very motivated. And we're hanging sheetrock and together. And again, I've had the privilege of working with him, and there were other people there working, but I had me with him, and I wanted to be by him because I wanted to talk to him again. I said, Brother Ringney, I don't know if
Mhm.
you remember, I told you a few weeks ago, God called me to preach. He said, yeah, I heard you. Hang that sheetrock. I hung the sheetrock. I thought,
Mhm.
well, okay, you know, he's busy. After that, a couple weeks later, come by and we're painting those walls. And I said, Brother Ringney, I don't know if you remember, but I was called to preach. He said, yeah, I heard you. Paint that wall. I went
Mhm.
we got through with the building. I went the whole next, when school started, the time of doing school again, we're in a new building doing school. And in May of 1994, I knew I was called. My only ministry assignment, really, I was teaching in the school, Christian education. By that
Mhm.
time, we had a basketball team at school, so I was coaching basketball. I was enjoying that. We had a second child, and I had told people in my family, but I had not preached a message. I had an uncle and his family. He was a lieutenant, or he was a full colonel, excuse me, in the Army, and they were stationed in Oklahoma City. And he had a 16-year-old son that they had just redid a '66 Mustang together. And his 3:30 in the afternoon on whatever day it was, he comes home. It's May. He says, "Boy, I'd like to have some ice cream." And my cousin Derek, who's 16, he says, "I'll go get it." He goes to get the ice cream and he never comes back. Pulled out in front of a car and he was killed.
Oh,
And when
my
I got the
goodness.
word that evening that my cousin had been killed, the Lord told me, he said, "You're going to preach his funeral." I hadn't preached a sermon.
Mhm.
"You're going to preach
Wow.
his funeral." And so the next morning, most of my family is lost. My mom and dad are saved. My grandma's saved, but all my uncles, my dad's brothers are lost. And I get a call from one of my uncles who's lost, and he said, I'm going to tell this, so you don't have to edit this out. My middle name is Jerome. My family calls me Jerome because my dad's name is Danny as well. And
Okay.
and so my uncle calls me and he says, "Jerome, your uncle Kenny wants you to preach Derek's funeral." I said, "I know." And he
Wow.
said, "Has he already called you?" I said, "No." I said, "The Lord told me last night."
Yeah.
And he didn't understand that. And
Sure.
I know it's odd. It's a funeral. But I knew God assigned me for that. I called Brother Rigney. Now, up to that
Mhm.
point, it was paint this wall. It was
Sure.
hang this insulation, hang this sheetrock. He sat on the rostrum at the funeral home. I mean, you've been a funeral director, and he sat on the rostrum at the
Yes, sir.
funeral home, not preaching the sermon, just sitting behind me and to be
Mhm.
behind me and beside me after I preached the funeral, for my family. So then I preached in church. He knew I was serious.
Yeah.
He knew I was called, and then he spent the rest of my time there mentoring me. He was mentoring me already, and
Sure.
whether he knew it or whether I knew it, I was being discipled.
Yeah.
I was being discipled by him to be. I'm not him, but he's my spiritual father, and I'll never forget. I mean, you know, 32 years later, he stood there, with me because he didn't know all my family. He knew my mom and dad, but he didn't know the rest of my
Yeah.
family, and they all respected him for that he would stand beside me to do that. So my first
Yeah.
sermon, was not get up and preach 5 minutes in church, or
No,
um
that's
first
incredible.
sermon was to preach my 16-year-old cousin's funeral, and
Yeah. Might
that's how my
might be the
ministry
first time
began.
I've ever heard it might be the first time I've ever heard of a first sermon being a funeral. That's and your cousin's no less. That's incredible, Pastor Danny. So, tell us about your first pastor. Did you youth pastor first or go straight into lead pastor role? Tell us about that.
No, while I was teaching, I transitioned to a part-time teacher my last year on staff at Pathway to being. They had just finished building the sanctuary that they're in now, and I
Okay.
became what was the evangelism director for Brother Rigney, and so I worked part time in the school, and
Mhm.
by that time I'd already done MIP and so forth, and
Sure.
mm, so I did that evangelism side. I'd had one other person contact me about being a youth pastor. I never felt that wasn't my call.
Mhm.
We went into a 32-week revival. This was in 1998, and I was
32
preaching.
weeks?
Yeah, a 32-week revival. I only got to be
Wow.
there for 13 of them, but I was doing itinerant preaching, doing some revivals,
Mhm.
had, privileges of doing some of those things. The overseer that we had at the time would contact me if in Northeast Arkansas they had a church that was open that needed somebody to fill in, and I would fill
Sure.
in, but I still had my responsibilities at Pathway. And I was called by our overseer in April to go and preach in Lepanto, Arkansas, because their pastor had left, and I had preached there a couple of times for the pastor there, so there was a little bit of a relationship. I had 2
Sure.
small boys at the time. We have a daughter as well, but we didn't have her, and, uh, and they were rowdy. I'm not gonna lie to you. They were, 4 and 5 years old, and
Sure.
they were typical church kids. They were rowdy,
Yeah.
and the overseer, Dan Hampton, called me and said, "Brother Pankey," and I didn't even know he knew my name. He said, "Brother Pankey, I need you to go and preach at Lepanto this Sunday, to fill in." He said, "And you're just going to fill in." And he was clear. He said, "I need you to preach Sunday morning, Sunday evening. We're in a revival
Mhm.
going on." Now, a couple weeks earlier in that revival, I did, I'd had a night where it was a real solemn night that I prayed for about 2 hours,
Mhm.
and I knew God was releasing me, and I knew God wanted me to pastor,
Wow.
but,
Yeah.
you know, they were about to move my position to full-time evangelism director,
Okay.
and, I was content with that, but I knew I wanted to pastor at some point in time, and Brother Rigney knew that, but I wasn't gonna kick a door down, and I remember getting a call from the clerk of that church, and he knew me a little bit, and, I think they were hard up for a pastor because nobody was, kinda taking the bait yet, and,
Mm.
he starts interviewing me over the phone. I said, "Brother," I said, I'm just coming to fill in." He said, "You mean you're not coming to try out?" I said, "No, sir." I said, "The overseer's clear with me about that. I'm not coming to try out. I'm coming to fill
Mhm.
in." And he said, "Well, would you consider it?" And I just said, I knew enough to say this was, "The overseer has told me I'm just coming to fill in."
Yeah.
And, so I talked to my wife about it. I said, "I sound like I've been interviewed." I said, "But, I'm just going to fill in." I said, I figured the overseer had plans for the church. He probably did, to be honest. He probably had
Sure.
plans. And, so that Sunday morning, I went. Now, my wife was the piano player at Pathway, and the revival is, going on, and I had to go preach there. And I said, "She's going to come back with me that Sunday night." I said, "We're not bringing the boys just in case." I said, "I don't
Mhm.
want to. I don't want to get right off the bat. These kids that are, you know, uh, if you saw how they left our pews, I didn't want anybody else to see
Gotcha.
these rowdy boys because I figured
Mhm.
they were the only 2 rowdy boys in the Church of God,
Right, I'm
but
sure.
they weren't."
Yeah.
And so we went that night, as we actually, cover this in my book, in one of the chapters about bold praying. And as we walk up on the church that evening, there were 3 people on the porch, and they were in an argument. And the argument, they began to yell at the top of their lungs at each other. I mean, back and forth. And we're walking in to come preach that Sunday night. My wife had never been to
Mhm.
Lepanto, Arkansas in her life. And I mean, well, I said, "I can preach unfettered. I don't have to worry about anything because we are, I mean, they're not going to want us to come pastor a church that we've seen them act like this. I don't want to go
Right.
pastor a church when I've seen people act like this." And I already had my message ready, and I was preaching on love that night.
Mhm.
And so it was a necessary message. And so so we went, and after the service was over, there were some people who weren't privy to the fight who began to give us a tour of the parsonage and everything. We're like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, right. We're not coming here."
Wow.
And so we went back home, went to revival Monday night. On Tuesday, Pastor Rigney called me to his office, and he said, "Brother Pankey," he said, "I need to talk to you." I thought, "Man, have I got myself in trouble again?" And
Bishop Hampton called.
and he said, "The overseers called me and told me
Mhm.
to tell you that the Lepanto church has asked for you and Sister Pankey to be their pastors." And
Wow.
I told him, I said, "Well, I said, be perfectly honest. I just don't, I don't know." I said, I told him what happened. And I asked him, I said, "How do you know when to go?" He said, "Well, this is a good move." And I thought, "You weren't there that night." And
Mhm.
he said,
Yeah,
"They're
right.
full time, they pay a full time salary." And that
Mhm.
was, I didn't know all the ins and outs of how salaries come about in the Church of God. I mean, look, I worked at a
Sure.
Christian school. I made next to nothing anyhow. And so, I mean, I was a part-time Altel salesman selling cell
Mhm.
phones on the side. And,
Alltel, that's a blast from the past.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Selling them out of the back of my car. And,
Okay.
And so I told him, I said, "Well, Pastor," I said, "I- if I've been to this revival for 13 weeks and I really haven't gotten anything out of it, I said, I would sure like a direct confirmation from God tonight."
Mhm.
And he said, "Well, it doesn't always happen that way." And I said, "How long do I have to decide?" He said, "Maybe 2 or 3 days." I went
Yeah.
home and told Tanya about it. And I have an Assembly of God pastor friend who actually owned the Altel business who was going to come his first night to that revival with me. And I told him about it. And that
Mhm.
night, Evangelist Linda Brewer got up and preached a message on Jonah going to preach in Nineveh, fulfilling your calling in a revival.
Wow.
What kind of
Mhm.
revival message is that? It's not a revival message. And the church was
No,
packed
that's
out, probably 250, 300 people.
yeah.
And
That
I'm
was a
like, and I
message
look
for
up,
Danny Pankey.
yeah, I look up, but when she gave the altar call, 30 people went up for the altar call about fulfilling your ministry. I said,
Mhm.
well, see, that wasn't for me.
Mhm.
I have to be hit over the head. And so I said,
Sure.
God, you got to get a little bit more, you know, specific. And then she gets up and she says, you are dealing with concerns about your future. There's a lot of people. There's 30 people there, you know. Then she said
Mhm.
this, there's somebody in this sanctuary who you ask God for a direct confirmation concerning your ministry tonight.
Mhm.
I said, okay, that's pretty close. I mean, it,
Yeah.
it just happened to be the exact words. And so I went to the altar and my wife is on
Right.
the piano. And then she goes, God's saying for you to leave your comfort zone. My wife had been the piano player there for 17 years from the time
Wow.
she was 11 or 12 years old. And
Mhm.
this was our hometown. And at that time, the worship leader at that church was Pastor Danny Rigney. He looked over at my wife. My wife looked at him because he knew what was going on. And she knew we were clear to go. And Sister Brewer left that rostrum and walked down to me first before
Mhm.
anybody else. And she had a direct line from God. And the next
Yeah.
morning, Brother Rigney came in. I said, Brother Rigney, I need to talk to you. He said, I figured you would. And
Yeah.
so the rest is kind of history, that, that,
Yeah.
that,
So
we were able to go to that church. And then, uh, I know already this is it's too late to say to make a long story short, but the people
you're
who
doing just
were
fine.
mad at each other, they repaired that. We had a
Good.
tremendous time. We were there almost 3 years and got to
Okay.
see, I mean, people saved left and right in this church. And in this community, small community, but we loved we had a daughter while we were there. And
Yeah.
it just, ministry was, I hate to use the term, but it was easy there.
Okay.
But it was, God gave us the assignment for a time. And
So you were
so
there almost 3 years. Then where?
then we went
Is
to
that
from
when you
there
went
to
to Marion
Marion,
or
and we were
okay?
there almost 10 years and had a tremendous time there. Have a lot of tremendous friends still in the Marion community. And we probably would not have left Marion. Again, I left Lepanto for Marion because I had almost a direct type of call as I had to go to Lepanto. And I had a
Mhm.
direct call to come to Ruddle Road in Blytheville. And I know people say that conveniently, but 3 years before we came to Blytheville, God told us we were coming in the altar of the Ruddle Road Church and during a revival.
Yeah.
And,
Wow.
you know, so I mean, I probably am one of these that I don't know if it's my lack of faith or if it's just that God has to hit me over the head,
Yeah.
or if I'm just Jonah going to Nineveh, I have to get put in the well.
Sure. Sure. So 3 churches you've pastored. The Lord's blessed you in all 3 different places. He was direct in taking you to
Yeah.
all 3 different places. You've served in state leadership. I want to touch on that a little bit before we get into your book. How did your state leadership begin? Was this, did you kind of start on the youth board as well, or tell us that?
I served once, one 2-year term on the youth board, and I mean I still worked camp for a long time.
Mhm.
But and for me, whether I was on the board or not, I was going to work camp. I had kids. I took kids from the church, and I got elected for the first time into state council, probably just because they didn't have at that time. Other people had just timed out, and I had the privilege, brother. Les Higgins, who has been one of my mentors in leadership, was when he first came to Arkansas, I got elected to the state council, and he mentored me. And I've had the privilege of, I'm not sure how many times to be on it. We have so many
Yeah.
good ministers in our state, so many people, and who are far more qualified than me. I, I do have a positive outlook toward our overseers and toward our
Hmm.
leadership. I think God will bless you with that, you know,
Sure.
and with positions if you're not not necessarily being a yes man, but if you're not a complainer, if you're not a murmurer, if you're I have people ask me
Sure.
all the time, you know, uh, when you get an overseer, well, is this a good overseer? I say, well, yeah, I've never had a bad one.
Yeah.
I've had one that was sent for what I needed at that time, and they've all sold into my life, from Brother Hampton to Brother Melvin Massey, who's passed
Hmm.
away, Brother Clausen, Brother Hart, um, Brother Higgins, Brother Brother
Morgan.
Morgan, Brother
Hmm.
Claypool, and now Brother Carver. I mean, all these overseers have sold something into my life, and I want to be able to. I've always wanted to be able to sow something back into theirs,
Yeah.
and so again, it's always an honor to have somebody elect you onto those, but at the same
Sure.
time, there's so many other people who may not have gotten elected or choose not to run. I don't think it diminishes what they've done or what they. I don't think it's always a sign of what your church does, because being on the state council or in the youth board doesn't keep you from having challenges in your church too.
Of course not.
Because we've
No,
been
and
through them as well.
there's wonderful pastors in our movement, in our
Yeah,
denomination, in our state who are
yeah,
doing incredible work in
yeah,
their churches, in their communities that may never sit on a state council, and there's nothing
yeah.
wrong with that. But there's something special about being a leader among leaders. When we walk into a ministers meeting, there's a church full. I don't know how many,
Yeah,
but there's a church full of leaders, and to see
yeah,
me,
absolutely.
I'm new to the denomination, and I'm seeing who is considered a leader among leaders. That means a lot to me, to see who kind of rises in that area. And when you're talking about the state overseers, I'm not naive enough to think that men and denominations don't make mistakes ever, but I'm also I've got enough faith to believe that we're governed in our denomination by
Mhm.
praying men who are seeking the Lord, and
Absolutely.
I believe that the Lord elevates people to certain levels of ministry and certain levels of leadership for a reason. And so
Yes.
I'm only on my second overseer, so I'm really not the one to talk about this, but it just seems like if an overseer comes in, we ought to be on his team and,
Exactly. I
figure
agree.
out how to minister in the state and how to help each other and how to help him. I don't think overseer work is easy. Can you imagine just moving around all the time the way that they do and come in and lead a bunch of pastors that initially they don't know. They don't know their
Mhm.
personalities. They don't know their churches. They don't know where they've been. They don't know what kind of ministries they've held. It's a challenging
Yes.
place. And so I think men like you who, again, aren't yes men, but are encouragers and supporters. And, I see you as a Barnabas. There was Peter who had all the position you could want. He was at the top of the church. There was Paul, who was certainly popular. Everybody knew who he was. But then there was Barnabas. He just had a burden and he helped people. And the reason Paul had the ministry he had is because he came in and nobody really knew him. Nobody,
Mhm.
what they did know of him, it was the equivalent of Osama bin Laden walking into our church and wanting to preach.
Yeah.
But Barnabas
Yeah.
put his arm
That
around him and he supported him and he helped him and he introduced him to the church and he was there to help him. And that's why Paul had the ministry he had. So I appreciate that stance that you take with our state overseers.
I think that,
Now,
again, they just, they do have so much on them, and I think of the times, the farthest I've pastored away from my hometown is 50 miles, but going to a church that you
mhm,
didn't know
yeah,
people, how challenging that can be, and they go to a state that they don't know anybody, and
right.
and I think we just have to welcome them in and say, "Listen, you're Arkansas now." You know,
Right.
I mean, you're Arkansas. You're an Arkansas overseer, and we want them. We may not be the biggest state, but I'm not a person that has an inferiority complex about our size.
Mhm.
I think that
Sure.
we're the size that we need to be until we get bigger,
Mhm.
and there's always growth taking place, and whether a state has 100,000 members or a state has 15,000 members, you know, every member is important, every pastor is important, every
Sure.
church is important, and they matter.
Right.
And these men and their wives and their families that come in, they should be welcomed and loved with open arms and supported and know that they've got people behind them. And also, I think you know, I know that they're praying for us, and I want them to know that we're praying for them. And I have
Yeah.
each one of my former overseers that are living on my prayer list daily. I pray for them
Yeah.
because I
Great.
I I want God's blessings on them because I know the sacrifices they made, and I've caused them plenty of headaches because I've called overseers and let them encourage me. They've
Yeah.
encouraged
Yeah,
me,
for sure.
and and there've been times where they've talked me off walls, and so if they make mistakes, you know, they probably hadn't made as many that I've made.
Sure. We all do.
And I most of them are really good decision makers, and they're put in those places. And the same way with general overseers
For a
and so
reason.
forth. I think again, I think yeah, there's we some people don't like the politics. Politics is part
Sure.
of life.
Of
I
course it
mean,
is.
in every part of life, the politics is part
Yeah.
of it, and as long as politics don't dominate it, and I think that we people rise up because God allows them to rise up to those positions, and I love some of the new things that are being done right now. Some of the things that are being promoted in our denomination. So
Mhm.
much kingdom stuff is being promoted, and I'm seeing
Right.
that more and more, and that blesses me.
Yeah, me too. Totally agree. Now, let's talk about the reason we're here. You have written a book. It's launching today, and you've shared your heart with me on it, and just thrilled my soul listening to just the passion in your heart. And I know that this really came from personal experience. It came from a burden. It came from the moving of the Spirit on you to undertake this project. And so, I want you to talk to us a little bit about how this started, where this, came from, and then tell us a little bit about the book, and then we'll talk about where we can get it.
It really began burning in my heart in February of 2024 when God began to change my life and my own personal relationship. My book is called Bold as a Lion: Keys to Creative Prayer, or Bold Creative Prayer, rather. And it started in a state meeting. I have been
Okay.
privileged for years to take care of trying to transport people for meetings, and I'm not gifted. I don't sing, play instruments, and do things like that. So, but I love to drive. My dad was a car salesman farmer, so I've been around cars my whole life, and so I don't mind driving and picking up people. And I get to do that, and I get to carry them. And so, in 2024, Pastor Scott Shepherd was doing morning services for our prayer conference, and it was here in
Yeah.
Blytheville. He actually had came in, did the Friday morning, flew back to Georgia
Or ladies'
for
conference or
a
something. Was
ladies'
it?
conference, and then flew back on Saturday morning for service. And it was a torrential downpour. And we got to spend some time together, and I was having to call over. So we had to do switching to get times of it. And I was going to have to leave that service after I got there after 15 minutes because I had a member of my church that had passed away, and I was going to have to
Mm,
be at a funeral before noon. And so I was only going to be in his service about 15 minutes. And in 15 minutes, he shared a story from the book, The Circle Maker. And
yeah.
shame on me that I had not read that book before. But while he was sharing the story, I ordered it on Amazon right then
Mhm.
because I was
Yeah.
so enamored by it. And he was talking about bold praying. And I've read that book. I began to devour more books on it. I knew my prayer life had become more of I guess, it become more of a work than it was a relationship, and
Mhm.
I dried up in my prayer life, and that 15 minutes changed everything for me, and I reimagined my prayer life, not just rebuilt it, but reimagined it, and that journey has been for the last 2 plus years, changed things about me. I never journaled. I thought journaling, although I don't want to offend anybody on this, but I thought journaling was for girls and women, and I
Mhm.
journal more than all of them now, and I have my journal. I have a journal for each of my grandkids that will be written, and they'll get them either
Yeah.
upon the rapture or upon my death, the prayers that I pray for them daily. And but I mean, I began to journal, and pray boldly and begin to ask for things, and I cover many of these things in my book, and this just, it got on me, and God laid on my heart a desire to write a book. I didn't know what it was gonna be. And then in the fall of I mean, I knew it was gonna be about prayer, but in the fall of last year, probably about well, I guess in September, I began to pray every day for God to give me favor with a publisher. I had written a book before, and it was really hard because the publishing aspect of it was a
Mhm.
challenge, and, I said, I need favor this time. If I'm gonna write one, I need favor." 'Cause I
Yeah.
didn't have favor with the publisher then, and all the work had been really done by me, and I knew I couldn't do this alone, and I saw Travis had his book published, and that encouraged me, I was glad for him, and, but and he and I had actually talked about a book that I was gonna write, and I'd already had the title, but did not
Mhm.
have anything written. In
Sure.
January, after 4 months of praying for favor, I get a call from Travis's publisher out of the blue, and his name's Jeff, and Jeff calls me, and he says, "I understand you have a book you won't publish." I said, "Well, I have a book in me, but I don't have a manuscript." And he
Yeah.
said, "Well," he said, "You really serious about writing a book?" I said, "I am." And he began to tell me certain things and share with me about his publishing company, and I thought, well, okay, it sounds good. I called Travis after that, and he gave me good feedback on it. And I told him, I said, I'm going to pray about this over the weekend. And I prayed about it over the weekend. And Sunday afternoon, the Lord said, he just told me, I don't understand what your holdup is. You've been asking for favor, and I had a publisher call you.
Mhm.
What's your holdup? What are you doing? You don't want to write this thing? I'm like, no, I want to write it. And so I knew then, call him back. Actually texted him and emailed him, said, look, uh, I'm in. And so we scheduled a call for a Zoom video or Zoom
Yeah.
or FaceTime for Thursday of that week. Still hadn't had a page written. He had
Yeah.
never published a book that didn't have a manuscript, didn't already have a manuscript. And he'd never worked with somebody through writing a manuscript. I told
Yeah.
him that day, I said, I want to have the manuscript done by Easter, and I'd like to have the book by the time we have camp meeting in the first week of June. He said, you have he said, you're expecting a lot of yourself and me to do
Mhm.
that. I said, this is what I want. Between the time that I told him I would do it, I wrote a map out of what I wanted and felt like I wanted for the book.
Sure.
And so we started that day. And I wrote the manuscript in 5 weeks, and what I
Wow.
planned on 15 chapters ended up being 19 chapters, and again, part of it was technical, what I knew the Lord wanted. A big part of it was the Spirit would lead me to write a particular chapter on select days, and every chapter has a bold praying theme
Mhm.
and creative praying, and has for the most part a story that's real life story that I share of miracles, healings, of even disappointments. I deal very, very openly about burnout and how to
Okay.
pray through burnout and pray out of burnout. And I deal very openly about loss when we lose somebody or have a disappointment and the prayer doesn't go the way we want. So there's some vulnerability that I share with it. But I can't. My son is a great writer. My youngest son, Josh, who's a minister, and
Hmm.
he's very technical. And I have some technical. I use that, but I'm passionate, and I'm passionate about the life experiences that God has brought me through, both good and bad and challenging. And so this
Sure.
book, it's not a book just, I believe it'll help pastors. I think it'll help pastors. I think there's teaching moments in it for that, but I think it'll motivate people to pray.
Yeah.
Um, Part of the motivation for this goes back to a 7-year-old boy that rode our church bus. 2 years ago, I asked him one day, I said, his name is Milam. And I said, Milam, I said, did you have fun tonight at church? And Milam said to me, he said, yes. And I thought he's going to tell me they had fun with their children's church. He
Hmm.
said, praying is fun.
Wow.
He didn't say playing is fun. He said praying to
Praying is
God
fun.
is fun. And I know
Yeah.
praying's work, but Andrew, praying can be fun. I have fun praying.
Absolutely.
Of
Yeah.
course, I do prayer flights. I get to take
Yeah.
people up on flights, and we fly around our city and pray over our city, and so we get to have fun with it. We do prayer walks around here, where we'll walk around different neighborhoods and pray. They pass out invitations to church while they're praying. Pray over cities, pray over the school. We may walk around our school and pray.
Yeah.
We do prayer drives where we drive around the city, and have fun doing it.
Yeah.
I think you can have fun while being bold. I think you can be creative. There's so many other ways to do it, and praying doesn't always have to be praying positive either. I tell a story in here about a real life prayer I prayed over a person that stole my truck. I'm not going to share that now. They'll have to get the book to read that. I want people to remember first and foremost that prayer is about access. Bold praying is about
Sure.
access to God, and I believe in that. And Scott Shepherd, who initiated this fire in me, shared with me, going to your father is like refrigerator rights. And when my parents were alive, when I went in their house, I never asked them if I could go in the refrigerator. I just went.
Sure. Right.
And you know what?
Well,
I think that's kind of what when he says we can come to his throne boldly.
yeah.
We
One
get to go to
thing
God's refrigerator.
that I'm so excited about this book because one thing that sanctifies us is prayer. We're sanctified
Yeah.
by 5 different things according to scriptures. And one of those things is prayer. Prayer is the most powerful tool that we have in our arsenal as Christians against the enemy, spiritual warfare. But prayer is not just about spiritual warfare. It's about communion with our God, with our
Yeah.
Savior. And so I'm really looking forward to it. The Bible says that the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. I want my prayer to be effectual, and I want to grow in
Too.
that until the day I die. And so, if you are out there and you kind of struggle with prayer, maybe, and you don't know what to pray or how to pray, or I think this book is going to be a really good resource for you. So, Bishop Danny, as we wrap this up, why don't you tell everybody where we can get this book? I'm super excited about grabbing my copy at camp meeting, but there's going to be a lot of people that listen to this that aren't going to be able to be at camp meeting. So, where can they get the
Yeah.
book?
I have two ways. I have a personal ways of getting them from me directly, which will be, I'll be setting up a Facebook page that will
Okay.
have copies that I'll have on hand, and it'll have, email. My Facebook's really easy, Danny J. Pankey. I'm the only Danny J. Pankey on Facebook. And then there will be an author's page on Amazon that it will become available on that. I hope to actually be setting up shortly an online bookstore that I will actually have this and my previous book, which is called Make Your
Good.
Life Count, because these are partly philosophical. They're partly who I am, but I believe these are what God wants us to become.
Sure.
And so I'll have them available there. But I do know that there'll be an Amazon authors page that'll have my book available really, really easy that way as well. But again, I'll be the easiest way to
Good deal.
contact, and my email is readily available, and and you can more than welcome to put that out there on this as well.
Sure can. We'll put it
Um,
in the show notes. Guys, get a copy of this book. It's being released today. Bishop, I love you. I appreciate you. I'm proud that you're my friend, and I'm looking forward to spending next week with you at camp meeting.
Man, I do too, Andrew. Thank you for the invite, and man, I appreciate you, and I look forward to more of these podcasts, and let me say this too. We will also be in the next couple of weeks be launching Bold as a Lion prayer podcast that will be
Awesome.
will be will cover the book, but it's not just for the book. It will be we will be covering so many different topics on prayer. I will probably have somebody like Andrew on there because we'll be doing guest spots as well because I really want people praying. I think the more people, if we
Yes.
can encourage people to pray, and I want to say this, another thing that I have as a desire for this book is I want it to inspire people to pray creatively. I want it to inspire people to want to do prayer flights. I have a goal of seeing Christian pilots that will use their planes to pray over their communities, particularly
Wow.
not all the metro communities, but the average sized communities we have in our nation, and just flying
Sure.
over and praying, taking their mayor up, taking their state representative up, taking their pastors up, taking their own church people up. I've had the privilege of taking all those kinds of folks up, and we'll be actually going back with those again soon as plane gets repaired and more
Yeah.
prayer flights. And I might be coming to Hot Springs to do a prayer flight.
Yeah, I'm on board, brother. Sign me up. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in. God bless you. We'll see you next time.